You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art it? Mr. Wood art Ed me.
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am joined by the author of a new book, The Dog's Gaze, A Visual History. Welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me, Thomas Laqueur.
Thank you for having me.
The book is absolutely fascinating. The Dog's Gaze, you're looking at art history and talking a lot about dogs. I'm just like, I love art history. I love dogs. That's why I'm so thrilled to be talking about this today. But I'm curious, what was your inspiration? Like what clicked for you that you're like, I've got to write this specific book?
So I was asked in 1995 to give a talk at a spectacular exhibit at the Berkeley Art Museum called The New Child in British Art. And it was it was our last blockbuster exhibit, and it had some of the most famous paintings of the 18th century, paintings by Hogarth and by Reynolds and by Gainsborough and by all the greats of 18th century British art. And I went to see the show before I spoke. And when I began my lecture, I said, look, I'm going to speak about the new child and about the interest in children's play and the innocence of children and all these issues that come up in the 18th century. But I was struck by the fact that a third of the paintings had dogs. And that if I were given a different brief, I might give you a lecture on the new dog in the 18th century. So that was striking.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about this is the dogs weren't there, quote, symbolizing faithfulness, which everyone says dogs do. They were playing, they were looking at kids, they were romping with each other, they were doing all sorts of things, but they weren't being particularly symbolic. So then I thought, okay, it's fine. And I kind of filed this away. But once I started seeing all these dogs in British art, I started seeing them in other art. And I suspect if your listeners, even now, were just so far into the conversation, were to go into any museum, they would be struck by how many dogs they see in all sorts of paintings. Some of them are about dogs, but most of them, they're just dogs around. So I got interested. Why are so many painters, and not just any old painters, but the great painters of the Western tradition, and interestingly also the Iranian and Persian and other traditions, so interested in dogs? So that's got me going. And I looked at more and more art, and then the usual things happen over the years. People asked me to give this talk and that talk. And then I said, well, maybe there's a book in this. So
yeah. Well, and one of the things that struck me as I was, starting to read the book is, and what I appreciated was you talked about dogs as not just a symbol in art, like, the stereotype, or like the first thing we always think of is dogs loyal, and dog is a symbol of loyalty and fidelity or whatever. But I remember reading a passage where you were talking about how dogs interact with us and how they bond with us, and like the relationship between dog and human being as different from other creatures. We have house cats, but cats, they can take or leave us, like they're happy in so many ways. And dogs, it's just a little bit different in the way that they bond with humans. And it feels natural for art, which is such a reflection of culture, that dogs would be a part of that because they are such a part of society and how we live and how we go about our daily lives. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the meaning of dogs beyond just that loyalty, what's some of the symbolism and all that?
That's good. Well, I wouldn't actually call it symbolism so much as what you said earlier about seeing. So I call the book The Dog's Gaze, A Visual History, because it's really a history of dogs seeing in art. So art is, after all, about seeing. Let's look at the art. It's presented to us visually. And what dogs do in art is look in ways that are important to the artist. There would be a dog looking at a person, which suggests that the artist is interested in us in creating that relationship. A dog sitting in front of the painting looking in the position where the artist might be. a dog peering into the painting from the outside, from edges, often entering a scene, which edges are being important in art and suggest this is the way into the painting. So dogs are just doing all kinds of different seeing. They're looking at a dead body. They're looking at all kinds of things. And so seeing and what I call the gaze is crucial. So then I started to think, so where does that come from and why? I mean, dogs are the only creature that do this in art. And part of the history, part of the story is biology. As I say, horses are often there basically to be set upon by great men. There are lots of horses, or they're in battles. But horses don't keep focusing on people. Horses' eyes are at the side of their heads. They're prey animals, and so they're constantly looking around rather than trying to focus on something. They just want to know, is anyone about to attack me? And of course, our relationship to horses on their back, so we don't see them. And cats can look at us if they want to, but as you just said, they often don't. So dogs are constantly looking at us. So then the next question is, well, why? And as all sorts of these why kinds of questions, the answer is, in some level, evolutionary biology. So the dog we now know comes from the ancestral gray wolf. The ancestral gray wolf is a animal that hunts in packs and hunts by visual contact. So the wolves are looking at each other. So the dog evolves from this creature whose relationship with other creatures is visual. So exactly how this happens, no one knows, but it happened a long time ago. The most recent evidence is probably around most solid evidence is 17,000 years ago. So evolution produced an animal whose major trait in relation to us is seeing. And it produced this 10, 12,000 years before it produced the next domestic animal, the cat. So we've lived a long time with an animal that is miraculously, in some sense, evolutionarily adapted to be interested in us. And now there's all sorts of scientific evidence, studies in ethology which show, how dogs follow our gaze, the way children do, how dogs ask us for help if they need help. So, and so forth. So dogs, dogs are how to put, I don't want to say made because evolution doesn't make, but dogs evolve as a creature which is engaged with us. And that then gets translated, as you say, into culture, into all this sort of culture, our interest in seeing and being seen, which is, after all, what art's about.
And that's interesting. And, as you were doing your research for the book, there are many pieces that you analyze and you talk about and describe in the book. And I'm curious, as you were doing your research, how much did you get a sense, or were there any artists that seemed sort of like consciously and deliberately aware of some of this history and connection with the dogs compared to just like intuitively, like it's just there?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, look, for most artists, we before the 18th century, we know almost nothing biographical. So it's very hard to say. Modern artists, an artist like Wegman is obviously really interested in dogs looking. Whether he's looked at the evolutionary biology, I rather doubt it. Obviously, David Hockney with modern artists is interested in dog seeing. Joan Brown, there's a whole bunch of people I guess you could ask whether they knew all this. My suspicion is not. My suspicion is that our artists are seeing the world in that special way they see the world. And they, first of all, they see in real life dogs looking at people. I suspect that they sort of come to see this then as a way, as a formal device of structuring their paintings. In other words, when an artist is painting someone walking along on a Greek vase, and they see it, the person walking sees a statue, the dog's a little bit ahead, and the dog looks back at the man saying, "Oh, there's a statue up ahead." Mm-hmm. So they use these gestures to make their art, But I suspect you didn't know all this evolutionary history, I suspect. In other words, and you still see these dogs in art. You don't need to know. You need to intuit it. In other words, if I'm looking at you now in the face rather than sitting like this, side, I don't have to have a theory about the fact that humans contact through eye contact. We grow up understanding that eye contact is the way humans relate. Right? So I'm reluctant to say they know anything about this whole background story. I think our relationship to dogs is very much like relationships to people in art. That is to say, if you put your hand on someone's shoulder, it doesn't much symbolize friendship. It's a connection. We do this unthinkingly because that's how we, in our culture, relate. Other cultures have different gestures, but babies grow up understanding what gestures mean. So that's really what I think they understand what seeing means, and another creature seeing is a bigger story. And I think that's the story that humans have always been interested in animals, have painted animals since we started painting. And John Berger has a wonderful line that we're interested in animals because we're lonely as a species.
That's an interesting thought, because I mean, I think there's truth to the fact that people are constantly seeking connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think today especially we hear a lot about loneliness and people's experience of that and how that's coming out. I don't know that that's always been the case, though. I feel like humanity has traditionally been very close-knit in groups because that's kind of how we survived.
Right. We have been. I don't know whether we're lonely in the past, but gosh, there are a lot of dogs bonded with their masters, whether you want to call it because of faithfulness, or I would just say bonded. I mean, Argos recognizes Ulysses when he comes home, and Ulysses weeps.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say that the very first picture we have of humans doing anything with an animal, that is, they're not just pictures of the animals themselves, but humans and animals doing something together, is a picture of dogs hunting with humans on petroglyphs, drawn on petroglyphs in the Arabian desert about 9,000 years ago. So you ask yourself, it's sort of a mystery, why would someone who survives by hunting, these guys don't have a lot of leisure and they're not having a bunch of people graduating from art school, why would these people spend the time to etch themselves into a stone hunting with dogs? And they're real dogs. They look like our dogs, and they're looking back at the person, and they're hunting a horse or an equid of some sort. So humans have been interested in this relationship, or presenting this relationship, since we were interested in producing or doing something with someone. And that's a really deep mystery. I mean, if you really want to go back the mysteries, why are we interested in spending all this effort on art?
We
don't want to go there, but it's a big question.
It is a huge question, and I've always wondered about that. And I think throughout different times and different cultures and for different individuals, the purposes certainly could be different. You're not going to find the one answer for all people, but I think there is something just fundamental about that human drive to create. Like I've always said, it's how and why we got out of the trees is our capacity to envision a better future, and communicate that vision to others.
Right.
Back to the depiction of animals in work. And I started to think about, is it more about the artist's connection to the animal and trying to portray that? Is it about the subject's connection to the animal and trying to portray that? Or is it about using the animal as an entry point for the audience to connect with the work?
Right. Well, I think it's the last of yours, using the audience, but it only works, of course, if the artist understands what this creature does. In other words, biographically, we might say Picasso loved his dog Lump. Great. Lump comes into his family. He immediately paints a wonderful dog bowl for it. He talks about how this is not just an animal, and it's not a man. It's something completely different. And so when Picasso is struggling with Velázquez's great painting Las Meninas, which has his big dog in it, Picasso paints 15 of these pictures have the dog prominently. So in the one sense, you could say Picasso is really interested in his dog. We know he's interested, biographically, we know he's interested in his dog. On the other hand, he's also interested formally in understanding this painting, which is probably the most influential painting on his career. I mean, it's the painting against which one master defines another. And so he's interested in just I don't want to say visuality so much as interested in sort of figuring out what this dog does in Velázquez. So there's this personal connection, wanting to have this big-eyed dog in front of his pictures, but there's also the kind of formal question of understanding what a dog does in a painting. And so with Picasso, we actually know the biography. With most artists, we don't. Can I give you another example that goes right back to the beginning?
Yes, but I wanted to tease out a little bit more of that Las Meninas one, because that to me seems like such a fascinating example, because Las Meninas is such a complex composition that is all about the gaze when you stop to think about it.
Yeah,
like
sure.
It's, putting the viewer in the perspective of the royalty, looking at the court painter, looking at, and there's like so many different gazes around. Can you talk a little bit about the function of the dog's gaze in that composition?
Right. That's so interesting you should say. So one part that struck me is the hundreds, if not thousands, of articles written about Las Meninas, scarcely any mention of the dog, which is kind of odd. Because Velázquez's first biographer, Palumbo, back in the 17th century, who first identified all the people in the painting, talks about the fact that, and then there's this large brown dog in the painting, which adds weight and gravity to it. So Velázquez's contemporaries understood that this dog is really important in terms of both its massiveness and its solidity on the ground. Right? Mm-hmm. So there's that clump there that we have to think about. And then you're absolutely right. It's crucial in seeing. My version is that the dog is looking out at its master in front of the painting. So in the painting, Velázquez has to be in front of the painting himself, so to speak. I mean, you're looking at the outside. He's painting someone. I think they're out here, and we know this dog actually belonged to Philip. This was a private painting. Was going to go in his private quarters. We know this was his favorite breed of dog. This Mastiff. So my version is it's the connection between the dog in the painting looking out at the people being painted, and also looking out at sort of where notionally the painter had to be. So I can't do a diagonal on your screen, but looking at the front of the painting. But it's crucial in seeing. It's a really as what you just said. It's a crucial part of the visual magic of that picture. Now, Picasso is more bold about this. In Picasso's illustrations, the dog is looking straight out at him, Picasso, the artist, which also makes
Picasso was never a subtle guy,
which also makes me think that the dog is looking at both Philip and it's a weird painting. If the painter's back here and the subject's back here, he can't be painting him, but it's an impossible painting, as you just say. Yeah. Right? You can't figure out all that. That's what makes it so magical. But the dog has been noted, was at the time, as this crucial feature, and it's a known dog. We know this to be Philip's dog.
Yeah. And now I'm sorry I had derailed you a little bit, because you said you had another example you wanted to bring up.
Well, I'm just trying to respond to your picture about your question about what artists knew and about this issue of dogs gazing. So many, as you know, Western art history courses begin with Giotto,
Yeah.
And that's because the great Vasari, who's advanced art history, says that Giotto created our art and created our capacity to exemplify the world. So not just modern art history teachers of Western art, but the man himself who invented art history says this is the beginning, all right? And so the most famous painting is the Life of the Virgin in the Scavoni Chapel, and in the painting, remind you, Joachim, the father of Mary, goes into the temple to make a sacrifice, to ask God to have his wife Anna bear a child, and because Anna's barren, people take him to be sinful, something wrong with him, and he's rejected. And he goes into the desert, and he's dejected, and he's morose. And this is painted off in this series. And this is the amazing thing about this. Giotto, you see next painting panel, you see Joachim in the desert. You see the shepherds his shepherds, I guess, herding sheep, they're looking away. And a white dog comes up to him, puts his paw on his leg, and looks up at Joachim. And Joachim, with the halo, looks down at the dog. All right, so there, Giotto, who creates this sort of sense of what is it to exemplify a human, this kind of story? What is it that make these things come alive? Puts in a dog. Now, this has been painted lots of times. Never has anyone put in a dog.
Yeah.
So you want to say, wow, it's part of the kind of thing when Giotto invents this modern version of exemplification, so to speak, representation, he puts in a dog. Now, we don't know what's in his head. We know nothing about Giotto. And then the next painting in the series, by this time, then Joachim falls asleep, and an angel comes down and tells him that Anna has conceived. And you have this blue sky, and you have Joachim asleep, and on a rock between the angel coming down from heaven and Joachim is the dog guarding him. It's kind of breathtaking. And it's kind of about the dog. The dog cares for him. The dog's interested in making a connection. Now, what can you say? I mean, that this is invented by the person who is said to have invented modern Western art. It seems pretty important to me and kind of miraculous. And it's never been done before. I mean, in modern Western art, there's a lot of dogs in Greek art and Babylonian art, So so that's what is so intriguing. And we can't answer the question of why, how he puts it there. It's because he's a genius. I mean, it's one of these things. Wow.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that once you see it, you start seeing it everywhere.
You got it. You got it.
The example that I think of that, was really one that I never really even noticed the dog before until I was prepping for this discussion was Gustav Cailbat's his painting of the bridge. Like right. For me, his work was so much about Paris in the 19th century and all the redevelopment that was happening there. And he's got such this studied engineer's perspective on the city. And we see the trusses and we see all that. And then boom, there's a dog front and center.
It drives me crazy. You're absolutely but you can't imagine more prominent dog. The dog is looking down the perspective line. The dog is crucial, and we know that he studies he's historically, we know he worked on this. Yeah, no one sees it, but they're crucial. I mean, look, I'll give you another example. Courbet's The Funeral at Ornans is another one of these paintings that everyone studies. And if you start looking at the literature, people have identified the socks on the two older guys and said, well, these are socks from people in the Revolutionary era. So that we know as you say, we know know everything about the painting. And there's this huge dog standing at the corner. And in fact, a dog that Courbet had painted before, after rather, So we know Courbet's interested in this dog. Does anyone notice the dog or ask why it's there? No. But once you start seeing it, and then you start looking at other Courbet paintings, and his first self-portrait is him sitting with the black dog, and his big painting of himself walking open paint is meeting his patron who has a dog. And so once you start looking at this, Courbet's paintings are full of dogs. And I don't think Courbet was particularly a dog lover. In fact, we know he hung out with cat lovers, but he needs dogs. That's what's so fascinating about it. You don't see it, and all of a sudden, they're everywhere.
Well, because I think when you stop to think about it, like the dog brings in a softness to it in something that is so much about the steel, the structures, and, the industrial revolution and the industrial age. Like, I don't want to see just smokestacks. Right. I don't want to see just the welding and the rivets. I want something that gives me that comfort and that like ease of entry. And I think that's why like the dog right on the perspective line, like right in the middle, literally walking into the composition.
Right, exactly.
Is a brilliant choice.
It's walking into the composition. It's oh gosh, there's a scene here.
It's inviting.
That's exactly the right word. The dog is inviting. And painters that's dead on. Painters using this all the time. So you take a great, the largest painting in the Louvre is Veronese's The Wedding Feast at Cana. And it's opposite the Mona Lisa. So most people don't see it, even though it's a big screen. Yeah. Okay. There are 5 dogs inviting me to this picture. There's a dog in the balcony looking down. There's a dog in the corner looking in. There are 2 dogs in the middle looking over at these sorts of guys. And other dogs are connecting with the Christ. And there's a dog on the table trying to get bread, looking straight out at us. So it's exactly what you should. These dogs are inviting us. This is pretty interesting, as one dog looks in. Yeah. Well, it is interesting as another dog comes in. And again, Sir Kenneth Clark said that Veronese was the greatest dog lover of the Renaissance. We have no idea of whether Veronese in fact loved dogs, but they're everywhere. And they're doing exactly what you're telling you. They're inviting you in, they're making you look, and they're with you. They're another gaze. And that's what seems to be so interesting. And they're now you could have a human being doing that, I suppose. But the fact that it's another creature to whom we relate, I think, is connective.
Well, and I think because, the thing about dogs is, as opposed to a human being, the dog doesn't have the baggage that a lot of human beings do. As soon as you see a person, you see what they're wearing and you start to make assumptions about what type of person is this? Are they the upper class snob who's looking down on me? Are they, like there are all sorts of associations we bring to it. But with the dog, it's always just like, oh, like it's more. I mean, nothing's universal, but a dog is more open to everybody.
Well, it seems almost universal. I mean, almost every culture has dogs in their art. Looking at them, and it's. I guess you're right. It's sort of, it's an innocent look. The dog. The thing about dogs is they want to look at you. Like cats will look at you when they want to, and they don't. And humans are unreliable at looking at you, but dogs really are reliable at looking at you. Yeah, and I liked what you said about comforting too. There's very little. There are very few bad dogs. So what happened to all those dogs that bite people, and bad dogs and fighting dogs, which people have written about? And my thought about this is that painting is seldom about a disrupted world. It's about a world that's trying to make order. I mean, there are war pictures which are about disorder, but most painting is about creating an order, and the dog is part of this creation. As you say, it's natural creating this order. The only really bad dogs in art are dogs that reflect bad owners. That is, dogs. You said the dog doesn't have mens res, and the dog can't contemplate a crime. So dogs in art used by the Spanish to subdue the native peoples of America, and dogs used by slave owners reflect the evilness of slave owners and the evilness of the Spanish conquistadors, and not the evilness of dogs. In fact, in many stories, you have the better than human dog, the dog that refuses to hunt a slave, or the dog that refuses to chase down a native person. And of course, in in Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, dogs are also friends of slaves. So when a dog goes bad, it's all, in art at least, it's almost always an owner a human that's gone bad.
I would say that's probably true in real life as well. I mean, dogs are not naturally bad and ill-tempered, and I mean, aside from like the rabies or something, it's like something wrong with their disposition, is something wrong in their socialization.
Well, there must be psychopathic dogs like the psychopathic people. I mean, there's always I don't know very much about that, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Person is not a psycho killer, and neither is the average dog.
Yeah. And now, just to sort of bring a little bit of closure here, and I want to plug the book again. For listeners interested, you can check the links in the show notes. This episode's being published June 1st. The book is going to be available at your favorite stores starting June 2nd. So starting tomorrow, if you're listening the day this publishes. But, The Dog's Gaze, A Visual History. What do you hope the readers will take away from this?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of great dog stories, and people who like dogs will. But I'm even hoping that cat owners who are looking at paintings, who like art, and even people who have no dogs or cats, will start to see things in art that they hadn't seen before and wonder why it's there. I thought your example of the Kaibot warms my heart. Because it says that someone like you, who's experienced in looking at art, starts seeing something different when you think about the Dog's Gaze, and it makes the painting different. So just as artists put these in because they needed it, and we have lots of examples of artists putting in a dog when they revised the painting because they realized we need something. So I'm hoping that people will come to look at art in different ways, not just dogs in art, but about how paintings work in terms of who's seeing what, and how the visual structure of the painting is made. So it's I guess the takeaway would be people seeing art in new ways that they hadn't seen before.
Yeah. And I got to say, as somebody who has studied a lot of art, this book did give me some new insights and fresh perspective and just how things are constructed. Because I've learned a lot about the elements and principles of design and stuff like that. And like I said, I've looked at my fair share of art, and this is one of those things where it's like, once you see it, it clicks and it makes sense. And I love how clearly and thoroughly you explain the ideas behind and the associations that we have historically with dogs. And it's like, oh yes, that's why it's there. And now I start to see it, and I start to see things a little bit differently, and I'm noticing new insights and connections. I love it.
Great, someone has seen as much as you see it. People who haven't seen as much, I hope we'll start seeing more. And that was the aim of the book. And as I say, it goes back 25,000 years, and it tries to end in the present.
Yeah, and I absolutely love it. Like I say, you never look at the museum collections quite the same way after you have noticed A Dog's Gaze, A Visual History. Pick up a copy, highly recommend it. And thank you so much once again for taking the time to share your thoughts and your insights.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, Kyle.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.